Week number 6 out of 7, church closed. We're almost there. It's the home stretch. This week we're looking at patience. Patience. Remember, the reason we've been looking at this is partially what we put on when we come together as the people of God, which affects how we treat one another and how we interact with one another. And then we're also looking at the issue of growth, which I believe we'll catch up with next week when we talk about unity, which is not something we put on so much as something we grow into. So we've talked about compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. These are all virtues that Paul lists in Colossians 3, verse 12. And we're asked to put these things on and put love over on top of all of those. By the way, if you want to hear any of those again, they're online on our website. Go check it out if you haven't checked it out already. But we're talking patience this morning. I sat in on our Sunday school class that talks about what the sermon is going to be this morning. They had some good stuff. So if you catch one of them and you don't like what you hear from me, they had great stuff on patience this morning. Great examples too. But I remember when Stephanie and I were dating years and years ago now, we were at Great America, the amusement park north of Chicago, on a date, and we went to ride the Batman ride. I don't know if you know this one, but it's got the rail above, right? And you hang below. And there's 2 lines. There's the one that goes to the front, the very front row, and the one that goes to every other row. And the one that goes to the front row is 2 to 3 times longer of a wait, at least, than the rest. And you're talking a long wait. It required a tremendous amount of patience. But here's the thing about patience that you can key into. It was worth the wait. It was really fun to be on the front row of something where you can't see the rail and it goes upside down, and it was exciting. Patience. So, as we talk about patience, find James 5, if you would. It'll also be on the screen behind me. Terry he's done a great job of keeping up with me. James 5, we're going to look at verses 7 through 11, but we'll start with 7 through 9. So look along with me here. It says, "Be patient then," and I'm using the new NIV. "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door." Now, if you kept reading and went all the way to verse 11, by the numbers, you would see patience mentioned 4 times in that short span of time. And then another word that we're going to talk about, perseverance, mentioned twice. Perseverance actually has the same root there as patience, so they're very related words. Patience in some way, shape, or form then, in its root form is mentioned, that's 6 times. I knew I had it up there. Math is not my strong suit, just so you know. Patience, though, patience. If we were to define it, I would say, or the scholar I took this from would say, the long-suffering, loving attitude we have towards others is patience. Long-suffering. I don't know how that makes you feel, but that's patience. And James, in the passage that we're looking at today, will use 3 different examples. And we see one here in this first section we've looked at, the farmer. James talks about the patience of the farmer. The farmer waits patiently for the crop. In the Palestine of James's day, much like the same area of the world today, there are the autumn and the spring rains, which turn out to be the important rains. As it turns out, the stuff that happens in the winter, there's more rain in the winter. But James talks about the important rains that happen. One that happens in the fall. If it doesn't happen, the seeds don't germinate. So who cares how much rain you have in the winter if the seed didn't germinate in the fall when it needed to? And the spring rain needs to come in order for the crop to become mature. So it doesn't matter, again, how much you have in the winter. If you don't get that spring rain, you don't quite get a mature crop. So the farmer waits patiently for something that's very important. But if you notice, the farmer doesn't just wait patiently for the crop. The farmer waits patiently for the valuable crop. And that's important. The farmer knows a couple of things. There are rhythms to the seasons. There are rhythms to the way things work, and it has an effect on his task. And there's value in what he's doing. There's something really important in this. In fact, there's a livelihood at stake. Around our house, I like to grow things. If you go in my office, I've got plants. We purchased a house that has a tremendous amount of perennials growing around the whole place. I have no investment in those. I like them. We thin them out. But if they don't grow back next year, we'll still eat. We'll still be fine. We'll still have a livelihood. The farmer doesn't quite have that. The farmer has to rely on this, and it's a valuable thing. So James brings this up. What's he asking of his readers? What is he saying to us? The farmer, you see, understands that there's a need to do things the right way. So too with the life of faith. We're called to be patient because something important, valuable, will happen. And so he talks importantly about waiting for the Lord. If you catch that, we're waiting for the Lord. Now, there's two senses in which James uses this. He talks about waiting for the day of the Lord when the Lord actually is coming back. And then there's a sense which we can take this as God is with us as well. The Lord is near. He actually is here. And the whole issue of Jesus returning is in there. It's not happened yet, so it hasn't happened as soon as people expected. And yet, it will happen sooner than all of us expect. That's how it's going to work. But it's going to happen. It's going to happen at some point. And James indicates that it's not just waiting he'll get into that's important. It's how we wait. How we are patient as the church. Be patient, he says. Stand firm. Oh, and by the way, don't grumble. And about that grumbling, we're going to get into it more later, but it's unclear when James talks about that. Don't grumble. If he means, because he says don't grumble against one another. Does he mean that we're not supposed to complain about our fellow brothers and sisters, or that we're not supposed to complain to our fellow brothers and sisters? Most scholarly opinion I saw suggested it's probably both. But we wait for the return of the Lord. The Lord is near. We're to be patient. But he adds something to that. It's not just waiting, it's how. It's how we wait. So James gives us some more examples. And one of these just gets to be fun. Go to verse 10. We'll read verses 10 and 11 of James 5. He says, brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. So like I pointed out, we have patience. Patience is used 4 times. Now we have perseverance, same root, but it's a different word. If we add our definition of, you have patience up there, perseverance adds something different. It's not quite patience in the same way. It's a strong, determined attitude with which we are to face difficult circumstances. And James gives us 2 examples of perseverance to work with. And they each add their own sort of element to this picture of perseverance. First, the prophets of the Old Testament. Those are perseverance in the face of suffering, he says. And if you look back to the Old Testament, the prophets were called to be the voice of God. That's what they're doing. God says, deliver this message. The prophet delivers the message, and that comes at a personal price often. They have a hard life, the prophets do. Jesus, when he's preaching the Sermon on the Mount, makes mention of the prophets and their hard life. He says in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So the prophets were called, they're the voice of God. They suffered for being the voice of God. Jesus indicates this in the Sermon on the Mount. Even they'll insult you just like they did to the prophets. The prophets were persecuted, and he says falsely say all kinds of evil. They were slandered. That's what that is. They were slandered. And when James mentions them, then, it's important to note that they're persistent or persevering in the face of suffering, but it's suffering that's cast on them. It's not self-induced. And that's important. It's one thing for us to, we all make decisions where we'll say, I'll pay for that later, right? You'll reap what you sow. And it's one thing to be, you don't feel quite as bad in those cases because all right, this is self-induced suffering. I did it to myself. There we go. But it's quite another thing to have unjust suffering thrown at you, like the prophets have. Here's a real small example of where you're doing the right thing, but you have unjust, whatever it is. This will be a very small example, so it's not really suffering. It's just an unjust line thrown at you. But I remember throughout school, you may have experienced this too. You'll see it even today. You'll have two students. One will have studied, they'll get an A. One will have studied and get an F, right? Or not studied, and get an F, right? They didn't try. And they get the papers returned back to them. They're sitting next to each other. The one with the A and the one with the F, turns to the one with the A and says, "What'd you get?" "Oh, an A." "What'd you get?" "An F." And they look at the one with the F, looks at the one with the A and says, "Well, you stink." Or something like that, right? To cut them down to size, right? "Oh, yeah, well, you're just kind of dumb." That kind of thing. I don't know if you ever experienced that. But you're trying to bring it down to size. It's unjust, right? They did the right thing, and yet, somebody throws something at them. James says the prophets did it right. They persevered. Maybe even patience in there. They persevered in the face of suffering. But then he brings up this other guy, Job, right? Job, we're talking about patience this morning. I don't consider Job to be the greatest model of patience, perhaps. Job is a great model of perseverance, though, and that's why he brings him up. So let's recall the story of Job, if you will. Job was wealthy, very wealthy. And you can tally this up as we go along and see if you're close. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, servants to go and take care of all of those things, as well as the house. He's described as a great man, blameless, upright, and honoring God. That's Job. He's very, very wealthy. That's the long and short of it. Satan, in the book of Job, approaches God and says, I'd like to test this guy. Because I don't think he would worship you, God, if he didn't have all this wealth and all this stuff. And God says, I'll allow it. And so Job, within minutes, he's getting the messages that he lost it all. I mean, the messenger comes in and says, the camels have been taken away, they've been stolen, all the servants have been killed, I'm the only one who survived. And before that guy's even finished his sentence, the next guy's there saying, by the way, your donkeys are gone. Before that guy's finished the sentence, by the way, your kids all just died. Everything gone in a heartbeat. Now that doesn't quite satisfy, and we'll read in a moment that Job still honors God. He still worships God even after that. He's broken, but he worships God. Satan says, no, let's go a little further. Let's damage his body. God says, I'll allow it. Job gets covered, soles of his feet to the top of his head in sores, laying in ashes, suffering. And then his friends come and sit down with him and give him poor advice for 7 days. And there you have the book of Job. And what's James trying to say with Job and his life? Because we're talking patience, but we're moving into perseverance as well. Why would he choose Job to say this? Because he says, you have heard of Job's perseverance. And I wouldn't say this is patience, not in the strict sense we've used it. Perseverance is kind of like patience in the face of suffering. It's a little different. But we're adding something to this that's very important to the picture of patience that we'll bring in, which is, if you read the book of Job, and I'll read you a couple passages, it brings something in here. Job 1, verse 20 through 22 says, it won't come on the screen, just listen. This is after he's learned he's lost everything. It says, at this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell down to the ground in worship and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. That's what he says, and that's what he does after he loses everything. I don't know about you, but I don't think I have that. Job has that. Then, after he's covered in the sores from head to foot, laying in ashes, his wife comes to him and says, are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. That's his wife giving him encouragement there. He replied, you are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Let me read that again. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Now, Job has his moments. He's not perfect by any means. And I'm not going to criticize Job because, let's face it, he went through some stuff, and that was hard. Job is a model of persistence and perseverance. And the question of the book of Job is, if everything was taken away, would he choose God? We discover the answer is yes. Job might not be a perfect example of patience, but he chose God in the end because he knew he had something that was rooted in something deeper. You can see that in even his words after he loses everything. As one scholar, I like this quote this week, pointed out, he said, Job's is no groveling, passive, unquestioning submission. Job struggled and questioned, and sometimes even defied, but the flame of faith was never extinguished in his heart. And that's the thing, right? There's patience. It's not patience necessarily with Job, but when we add something to the picture of patience, just like we did with the farmer, there's something worth waiting for. Job has perseverance because there's something to the faith that he has in God, and we can add that to our picture of patience. And so I would suggest to you that what I pick out of what James is telling us about patience, we've thrown in perseverance there, but we're coming back to patience, is this: we should live small and think big in what James is saying. We're supposed to remember that the Lord is near. Whatever sense James is using that, whether it's that God is actually present with us even now, or whether it's the fact that at some point Jesus will return, because both are true. Jesus has not yet come back. We know that. It's never happened as soon as people expected, and it'll happen sooner than we expect. And people tend to live like one or the other extreme, I think. I think people live, I've met plenty of people who live as if Jesus is going to come back, but I've met far more who live like, yeah, eventually he'll come back. And we live one way or the other, and the truth of the matter is that Jesus will return. That's why James says what he says. The Lord is near. Live in that reality, and the question becomes, how are you living? Are we living in that reality? Are you living like this will happen someday? Or are you living like it'll happen at lunchtime? Where do you fall on the spectrum? We're called to live lightly, I think, as if Jesus will, in fact, return. I get too attached to the stuff of this world. We're not supposed to get so attached to that. We're supposed to live and think about bigger things and bigger priorities. It begs the question, what do you value if we're not really anticipating that God will come back? What else do I want to get done in that time? There's a classic story told of Martin Luther. Now, it's probably not a true story, but it's told of Martin Luther. You know, this happens throughout history. All these famous people get stories and quotes and things attributed to them that they never did. But we'll tell it. Martin Luther, in theory, was asked by somebody, what would you do if you knew Jesus were coming back later today? And he said, I'd plant a tree. And they said, why would you do that? And he said, because I'm supposed to expect that Jesus is going to come back every day. Why is this day any different? I should always expect that and live that way. We're called to live lightly. Expect that it's going to happen at some point. Yes, that the Lord is near even now, but yes, Jesus is in fact going to return. And we're called to think big about this, that God's plans are bigger than ours. And so James is talking about patience in the face of suffering. That's why you can use someone like Job, which is in fact a great example. I think he does well. And when difficulty arises, we need to have some perspective, which Job had. When you get down to it, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. He has this perspective. Even though it's all gone, it was a gift to begin with, wasn't it? God is still there. God is still good. When difficulty arises, we need to have a big enough perspective that's built on a faith that's there. Otherwise, it's a really rocky road and it's a really hard road. Live small, think big. The next thing, straight out of the text, Job says, don't grumble. This is really important with patience. I don't know if you've considered this. Don't be a group of grumbling believers, he says. We need to ask the question of what James means, I think, again. Does it mean don't grumble about, don't grumble to? I think the opinion is both, and I like that opinion. Don't grumble about and don't grumble to. And I'll tell you, here's my non-comprehensive list of things that we as believers and as the church ought not grumble about. Here we go. Avoid grumbling about worship. We did a sermon series on this. Avoid grumbling about worship. Look for the good. Was God glorified when we came together and when we worshiped? Was the Spirit present when we came together and worshiped? Are we fulfilling our mission? Because if we can't answer those all positively, who cares about the details, right? Those are the important details to cover. Don't grumble about worship. Avoid, next, grumbling about the actions of others. We had internet connectivity issues here this week. For some reason on the other end of whoever is giving us our internet service, things were slow. So there were a few moments where I needed to go get online, so I just went to a coffee shop and spent some time there this week and got my work done there. And you hear interesting conversations, right? I heard, I think it was Monday, in fact. I was sitting there, and over the wall I could hear the group of 4 people, very much churchgoers from all I could tell, very much the grumbling churchgoers from all I could tell. Man, that was a gossip session. They were just going at it, and they were judging everybody and everything, of course, except their own actions. They were complainers, very clearly. And they were complaining about everything else, and you could tell that they'd never approached anybody about these things. And that's just the problem, right? Sometimes we do that. We complain and we're upset and we have a problem when we do all these things, and we grump and we gossip and we grumble, and we never actually approach people. We never actually fix the problem. We just want to talk about it. So I created a little checklist because I think it's always useful. The non-gossiping, non-grumbling checklist to put in your mind when we approach these things, because it can happen to the best of us. If we find ourselves talking about somebody else, like the situation at Panera, we have questions we can ask in order to avoid grumbling and gossiping about them. The first is, am I speaking of the person in an edifying and kind way? The second question is, if they were with me right now, would they be pleased with the way I'm talking? These are questions I think they could have asked. These are questions I can ask occasionally too. And third is, what does it say about me that I would talk about somebody else in a grumbling or gossipy way? Avoid grumbling about the actions of others. Avoid then grumbling about life circumstances. Do you see, I'm trying to be as comprehensive as I can here, but I'm not going to get there. So you can add your own avoid grumblings later. Who's the focus of every conversation you have? I run into plenty of people for whom the conversation revolves around themselves. Now, it's not always around themselves, but then you run into those people for whom it's always about themselves. Have you run into these people? We don't want to be those people. Avoid grumbling about life, and that's all you do. It's not bad to talk about yourself. That's not the issue. In fact, it's important. It's important that we gather together and pray for one another, isn't it? And we bring those things to each other in prayer. It's important that we have people to support us when things are tough and when things are hard. But when all we do is grumble, we run into the danger zone of being this next thing, and that is avoid being the grumpy Smurf of the church. Avoid that. James has good reason to advise against grumbling. Do you know why? Grumbling is infectious. Grumbling is demotivational. And if you want to have patience, the last thing you want to do is surround yourself with grumblers. Because you're not going to win. You're never going to win. Job tried it. If you read Job, he's got people that are telling him very poor advice for that whole time that he's sitting there suffering, often grumbly type advice. When you're in the company of grumblers, even a positive word gets turned upside down, doesn't it? Just like this table I was listening to the other day, even if a positive word came in, it was flipped upside down. You talk to somebody who only grumbles, and what happens? Wow, it sure is sunny out today. Yeah, but it's going to rain next week, right? They're always turning it around. And that's not who we're called to be. Here's a joke for you. I've been picking on Presbyterians recently, only because we can't tell it about our own denomination. How many Presbyterians does it take to change a light bulb? You can answer. Okay, 4. I like that. I don't even know that. 3, in fact. It takes 3. 1 to change a light bulb, and 2 to complain about how much they like the old one better. You can't win. You can't win. I have nothing against Presbyterians. You can't win, so don't play the game. James says, don't grumble. Don't do it. And don't be a church that grumbles. And third is be an example of patience. Be an example of patience. I would add, not a reason for patience. One of the... I didn't know it was that funny. One of the things I like to think about is, how do I want to be remembered? And I don't just talk about the end of life, but as somebody who's moved a number of times, how do I want to be remembered when I move away from somewhere, right? We can think about that kind of thing. Are you the kind of person that, none of us would think this way. Man, when you move away, everybody's like, boy, I'm glad they moved away because they were a real Debbie Downer, or they were always so negative, or they were always so grumbling, or they were that kind of thing. When we think about how we want to be remembered, it can change our attitudes and it can change how we act, can't it? I'd rather be remembered as somebody who's patient, somebody who's kind, somebody who's all these lists of virtues that we went through. I'm afraid I'm not all the time, but I'd like to be that person. And so James is calling the church to exercise patience. And we can look at this from an individual perspective, and we can look at it then from a congregational perspective. If we look at it individually, we can ask, how are we going to exercise patience individually? And I think James gives us some answers. The first thing I would say is we focus on why we came to faith in Jesus Christ in the first place. Because that's going to give us that perspective that I was talking about before. Why in the world did I come to faith in Jesus Christ in the first place? It's a question I don't think we ask that often, but it's such an important question, isn't it? Did I just fall into this thing, or did I choose this thing? And why did I choose it? And now that I have it, what kind of a change has it made in my life? That gives me perspective. What's my life like now that I follow Jesus Christ? If we're looking for patience, we will think then about the fact that because of Jesus Christ, we can have the presence of God with us all the time. And that gives us perspective, and that can give us patience. That's what James is, in fact, aiming right at. He says you can have patience in the midst of suffering because the Lord is near. And not just that, you can have patience in the midst of suffering because you're not just looking at this short game, you're looking at the long game. Jesus is coming back. There is a fulfillment. There is an end to this thing. And it's going to be good. The Lord is near. And within the church body, then, if we want to exercise patience, we have to have that same perspective and keep in mind the reason that we exist. Well, on an individual level, you keep in mind why I'm here individually, what connects me here. But on a broader level, we think about the mission. And we're going to talk, that launches us into next week quite nicely, where we talk about unity. Even though we may not always see eye to eye on things, we're still called to the same mission. It's still the same spirit that gathers us together. And we're called to exercise patience in that community and have the broad enough perspective that would allow us to exercise that patience. Patience, as it turns out, is a virtue. Patience is also a choice. The way we choose patience is to remember why we are to be patient. What leads us to that? What's worth the wait? The farmer waits for the valuable crop, James says. The Old Testament prophets persevered in the face of suffering because the message was so important. Job knew that just because he was having a bad day, and it was a really bad day, and it was a bad days ahead, it didn't mean that God had forsaken him. He had a broader picture than that. He persevered. James calls the church to patience no matter what happens. He says, the Lord is near. Remember that. The Lord is near. Jesus is going to return one day, but even now the Lord is near. Let us live accordingly, and let us pray. God, we thank you for the examples that we have of patience and persistence, of patience and perseverance, of what to do in the midst of suffering. We thank you for the example of someone like Job who says, even in the worst of it, God, you're still there. How can we only praise you when the good happens? We need to praise you when bad things even happen. Difficult as that is, God, give us the strength to have patience, to see what's really of value in this world, to honor you in our decisions with one another, that we would exercise patience with one another, to have the perspective that's required, that even when we can't see eye to eye, we would be patient. God, we pray all this in the name of your Son. Amen.